everybody. Welcome to the Tournament Center here at Pro Tour Dragons of Tarkir in Brussels, Belgium. I'm Brian David Marshall. I'm joined by Ian Duke, and we are going to talk about mono red aggro.
All right.
So what is the appeal of the mono red aggro deck in a field where you think people, we've seen people playing green white devotion decks where their life totals are 300. We've seen board sweepers like Crux of Fate and End Hostilities, and what is the appeal of playing little red men into the face of that kind of metagame and red-green dragons and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so as these mid-range and control decks get into a sort of arms race about who can have the most powerful endgame, whether it's Nykthos pumping out Manifests with Master the Unseen, or Crux of Fate into Ugin later in the game, it opens up this gap where you can actually sneak underneath that and just kill these decks before they reach their mid or late game. So that's really the appeal of mono red aggro, and that's what these players are trying to do.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the cards in the deck. We start with the old favorites. These are cards that people have been playing in mono red decks for a while. Monastery Swift Spear, of course, being the first card. Talk a little bit about the human monk that could.
Yeah, so on its surface, it's just a Raging Goblin, a 1-power haster for R, but the prowess ability really is the key here. And as we saw when we were looking at the Jeskai Tokens deck earlier, you've got a lot of spells that can generate creatures, so your creatures are also counting towards your prowess, and then of course you have your flurry of burn spells later on in the game too. So this little Swift Spear can actually hit for 2 or 3 damage a turn pretty easily.
Okay, speaking of little creatures that can hit for a lot, Foundry Street Denizen. We haven't seen a ton of it before this current iteration of red again. It seemed to have fallen out of favor.
Yeah, and again, that's partially related to the token generating cards that we've seen. I mean, Foundry Street Denizen is perfectly serviceable just to play on turn 1 and curve out with some other creatures, but if you can play a token generating spell like, say, Hordling Outburst.
Moving along to our next card.
Yeah, this works surprisingly well with both Foundry Street Denizen and also the prowess of Monastery Swift Spear. Just, generating multiple tokens for one card, hard to answer unless your opponent's playing a creature sweeper.
So you lead with Foundry Street Denizen. Turn 2, you play a Monastery Swift Spear. This gets pumped. You wild slash their guy. You attack with both. Suddenly you're getting in for, a pretty impressive amount of damage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you follow up with the Hordling Outburst.
Yeah, pumping up your Foundry Street Denizen 3 times, pumping up your Swift Spear, making 3 tokens, you're good to go.
Right. And then, of course, the Goblin Rabble Master.
Yeah, has synergy with your goblins that you're making, the Foundry Street Denizen, the Hordling Outburst. If you play Dragon Fodder, it's got that too. But more so than that, Goblin Rabble Master is just a card that's capable of winning the game on its own if it goes unanswered.
So one of the cards that is, most of these cards are kind of ubiquitous across all the mono red decks we looked at.
Yeah.
Eidolon of the Great Revel was a card that kind of was, in the main of some, in the sideboard of some, not present at all in others.
Right.
Why is this such a controversial card maybe for the red deck?
Yeah, so in Standard, unlike in Modern, decks play more expensive spells. So hitting converted mana cost 3 or less against certain decks, it's not really going to hit that many of their spells. In fact, since you're playing the aggressive low curve deck, it's actually going to hit a lot of your own spells. So the Eidolon of the Great Revel is really at its best when you don't mind taking the damage yourself as the red deck, and you're also playing against a deck that has lots of cheap spells.
Okay, so there's a lot of new toys that we get to play with.
Yeah, let's take a look.
In the mono red deck. We can start over here.
Sure.
It's not red, it's red-green. It's a Tarkir's command, but not very hard to get the splash here.
Yeah, so if you're willing to go the extra mile and add green to your deck, a Tarkir's command is just a super powerful spell. I mean, it's always worth 3 damage to the opponent's face, but the other mode you're really looking at taking advantage of is creatures you control get +1/+1 and reach until end of turn. So if you do go with that token-based strategy, where you're casting Hordling Outburst, Dragon Fodder, Goblin Rabble Master, this can really represent a ton of damage for a 2-mana card.
Right, and you get to throw an additional 3 damage at the dome.
That's right.
Yeah. So, Lightning Berserker.
Yeah, this is one of my picks for one of the more exciting cards in the mono red decks out of DTK. We call it Fireball with Buyback in R&D, just because you can dash this out and just hit your opponent for massive damage. It's really at its best when it's following up something like an End Hostilities or Crux of Fate or an Anger of the Gods. Just you catch your opponent while they're tapped out and just get them for tons of damage.
Your opponent's like, well, I'm going to die next turn.
Yeah.
I have to cast Crux of Fate here, and then you get to maybe attack them for 5 with just this.
Yeah, and dash, as always, just making it resilient to sorcery speed removal.
Okay. Speaking of sorcery speed cards, Dragon Fodder, you've mentioned this a couple times. We looked at the tokens decks, and what we saw in the token decks was that Dragon Fodder had displaced Hordling Outburst.
Right.
But here in the deck that's mono red, and there's no real cost to getting to red, you're able to play both.
Yeah, it's more of a curve consideration here, just if you feel you need the extra 2-drop. It's not as powerful of a card on rate as Hordeling Outburst is, but it can fill out your curve decently and has a lot of synergy still with the Swift Spear, Foundry Street Denizen, and Goblin Rabble Master.
Okay, so we talked about Dash there. How about Zurgo Bell Striker?
Yeah, talk about a fall from grace. This guy doesn't have the same job he had sort of in the other timeline here. But Zurgo, nonetheless, sure to be a staple in basically any of the mono red builds. It's just a 2-power, 1-drop. It can dash. It can follow up a sorcery speed sweeper like an End Hostilities. Just really does everything you want for that point in your curve.
So again, you get to go Foundry Street Denizen. Maybe you just dash this into play on turn 2 when you have nothing else to do, and you're getting in for 4 on turn 2.
Yeah, and interestingly, the dash really helps you get around the legend rule. If you have multiples of these stuck in your hand, at least once they do kill the first one you have, the next one can come out with haste.
Sure. So you have all these creatures. You have the Tarkir's Command already as a kind of finisher. But let's take a look at some of the other ways you can finish a game. With this, how you can clear the board. Wild Slash has, obviously been a popular card. Talk about Stoke the Flames with all these Dragon Fodders and Hordeling Outbursts and Goblin Rabble Masters.
Yeah, another card that has great synergy with the token-based versions of the red deck. Often you can cast this for 1 or 2 mana, or even 0, just if you have a lot of tokens lying around. And one of the things to think about when you're building a burn deck is not just damage per mana efficiency, but damage per card efficiency. And getting 4 damage out of just 1 card, really, really crucial in a deck like this.
Where do you think the ratio is when you're playing a deck like this for how much damage you're looking to get out of your creatures and how much damage you're looking to get out of your spells?
It depends a little bit on how you tune your deck and what you expect the metagame to look like, but I'd say roughly speaking, you're aiming to get in 8 to 12 damage with your creatures early in the game, and if you can do that, it shouldn't be hard to piece together about 8
And then you
damage.
look at your hand and you're like, excellent.
Yes.
I see a Lightning Strike, I see a Stoke the Flames, I see a Wild Slash. I can finish the game from here.
Yep, absolutely.
A couple of other interesting cards. These 3 cards are ubiquitous across all the red decks.
Yeah, I think so.
All 3 of these were ubiquitous. The card that appeared in a majority of the decks was Hall of Triumph.
Yeah, this is a really interesting inclusion, and again, it plays into the token theme here. It's a little bit slow, and it does require sticking your creatures on the board, having them go unanswered, essentially. So this is a card you might see in like 1 or 2 copies. It's also legendary, so you don't want to get stuck with too many in your hand. But can be a really nice addition going with the token-based strategies.
And then another card that appeared in a couple of the decks, again, all the decks we pulled were from big teams and notable players. Become Immense is a card that I've been surprised to see in more than a few lists.
Yeah, so if you're going the Tarkir's Command direction and you're already willing to splash green, I mean, adding 1 or 2 Delve cards to your deck comes at a pretty low cost just because, they're not competing with each other for your graveyard. And you've got a lot of cheap burn spells. You've got cards like Dragon Fodder and Hordeling Outburst. They're like creatures, but they put a card in your graveyard right away.
Right.
So you can afford to play 1 or 2 copies of Become Immense, and I would certainly be surprised if my opponent played this against me. So I'm sure the players who are playing this have gotten some pretty key free wins off a card like that.
All right, let's take a look at the mana base here. So let's start there. There's, we see people playing, a forest generally.
Yeah, just to fetch up
It's like
with
a
your
forest,
wooded foothills.
4 wooded foothills.
Sure.
We see occasionally, we saw some mana confluences.
Yep.
And again, you talked about the idea that there's not, there's not like a red-green dual land. So, you have to play. You have to play the wooded foothills and then the mana confluence.
Yeah, and as the mono red deck, you're often not too worried about dealing a little bit of damage to yourself. I mean, you're certainly the aggressor in any of your matchups.
Right. And then we see decks playing as many as 22 mountains.
Yep.
Some decks playing an assortment of these others.
Yeah, and it's a lot to be said for just having a really stable mana base where all your lands come into play untapped in this format full of, temples and so forth, right?
Tri-lands and game lands. Tri-lands, etc. How do you think this deck was positioned coming into the weekend? And
I think generally pretty good. Like we said earlier, you're really aiming to take advantage of the decks that are in that arms race for who can have the best late game. That said, you do still want to dodge your Caryatid Courser decks can be a real problem for the red decks. But if you're going up against like Esper Control and Blue-Black Control, things like that, you're going to be in really good shape.
And which version would you go with? Would you be playing like a Tarkir's Command and Become Immense or some combination of those cards, or would you be going more like the 22 mountain?
Yeah, I think with all the new additions to the token-based focus for the deck, I really like the Tarkir's Command direction, and I'd probably try something like that out.
Excellent. For Ian Duke, this is Brian David Marshall, signing off from the Tournament Center.